look at the traditional roles of schools. Horace Mann, the architect of the common school system, ignored the existence of slavery and racism and described public education as the great equalizer. Mann was persuaded by the nature of the times to envision schools as institutions for whites. He felt that schools for the less privileged would provide them opportunities for social and economic advancement. Blacks eventually got access to public schools, but their treatment by the educational enterprise ignored their unique experiences and competitive needs stands as a national disgrace. America's school system traditionally served as a major conduit for racism. It cooperated with social institutions to maintain the structural inequalities that predetermined black children's life chances. Today, schools have not fully committed themselves to providing black children a high quality and relevant education. Instead, social scientists and politicians have devoted half a century to charging blacks with inferior intelligence and poor educational values. Historical facts debunk these charges, as well as the claim that schools fail black children. Education is supposed to reward citizens for academic achievements based on the rule that the more education you have, the more wealth and money you gain. However, Figure 11 tracks economic and educational progress and reveals that there is practically no relationship between black people's level of wealth and income and their level of educational achievements. Figure 11 educational gains and economic stagnation. 1860, eve of the American Civil War. Black people, black people enslaved 98 to 99%. Black illiteracy rate 98%. Wealth owned by blacks, one half of 1%. Business income, less than 1%. All right. 1896, end of Civil War Reconstruction. Blacks in semi slavery, 96%. Illiteracy rate, 40%. Wealth owned by blacks, one half of 1%. Business income, less than 1%. 1920, Great Migration to the North. Blacks second class citizens, 100%. Black illiteracy rate, 25%. Wealth owned by blacks, one half of 1%. Business income, less than 1%. 1960, Black Civil Rights Movement. Blacks second class citizen, 100%. Black illiteracy rate, 14%. Wealth owned by blacks, one half of 1%. Business income, less than 1%. All right. Mm. When we examine the educational accomplishments of blacks from 1860 to the 1960s, we see some astounding accomplishments. Figure 11 also shows that in the early 1860s, approximately 98% of America's black population was illiterate by design. Following the Civil War, nearly 25 million European immigrants came to America with the same literacy as the black ex slaves. Within the 30 years between emancipation and the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896, blacks cut their illiteracy in half, reducing it from 98% to 48%. Blacks reduced their illiteracy twice as fast as the European immigrants. However, as European immigrants achieved educationally, as European immigrants achieved educationally, they moved up in the wealth, income, political empowerment, social acceptance, and business ownership. Blacks were on the bottom and stayed on the bottom. There was no direct relationship between their astounding educational achievements and benefits. Blacks did not receive increased incomes, upward mobility, or political empowerment in accord with their educational achievements. The reason for their lack of forward mobility is simple. Educational achievement by itself cannot override structural racism and make blacks politically and economically self sufficient or competitive. This is true because education is a determiner, is a determiner. This is true because education is a determiner of class, but not but does not transcend or eradicate racial boundaries for blacks. As indicated in Figure 11 above, the spectacular educational accomplishments of blacks did not translate into the same economic benefits as they did for Jews or other European immigrants before and after World War One. Jewish immigrants were coming into this country with illiteracy rates equal to blacks. But since they were not black, they were accepted into the banking, clothing, entertainment, and jewelry industries and professions. As they were being accepted, a national racial backlash moved across the country in opposition to black people. In the South, members of the majority society burned black farmers' crops, poisoned their animals, poured kerosene on their farm crops, and lynched at least one black man per day. Their nearly impossible educational achievements did not change blacks' status in terms of power, wealth, and upward mobility. Even in the late, even as late as, even as late as the early 1950s, census data indicated that a white high school graduate earned more than a black college graduate. A black person earned only 54 cents for every dollar a white person earned. The largest number of blacks ever entered college. Okay, the largest number of blacks ever entered college and government service following the Black Civil Rights movement in the 1960s. The largest number of blacks ever entered college and government service following the Black Civil Rights movement in the 1960s. Okay, whatever. All right. Blacks earned income went as high as 67 cents for every dollar that whites earned, in the mid 1970s before falling back down to 56 cents in the 1980s. Income has remained relatively unchanged. Nearly a half a century after the civil rights movement began, blacks earned blacks earned income is back to where it was in the 1950s. Education has yet to offer the same economic or wealth rewards to blacks that it does to whites. Unfortunately, many black leaders, just like whites, tend to believe that the legacies of centuries of slavery, Jim Crow, and semi-slavery, and benign neglect policies ended in the 1970s. Unfortunately, many black leaders, just like whites, tend to believe that the legacies of Jim Crow slavery or of slavery, Jim Crow, semi slavery, and benign neglect policies ended in the 1970s. Even with increasing evidence that integration has failed, they continue to believe that integration, in and of itself, wiped the racial slate clean. They believe all ethnic and racial groups started out even in the 1970s, and therefore, if black people are suffering inequalities, they are due to the differences in natural talent. It is naive of black and white leadership to believe that 4 centuries of racial exploitation, oppression, and denial of educational opportunities can be also can be so easily erased. It is naive of black and white leadership to believe that 4 centuries of racial exploitation, oppression, and denial of educational opportunities can be so easily erased. Wealth and other inequalities continue primarily because the planned inferior education provided to blacks was never designed to give them countervailing power to offset the racism to which they would be exposed in mainstream society. Education is not enough. Since education was not designed to eradicate wealth and other inequalities between the races, were the descend were the descendant of slaves were the descendants of slaves wrong in wanting an education? Since education was not designed to eradicate wealth and other inequalities between the races, were the descendant of slaves wrong in wanting an education? No, they were not wrong. It's just that education was not enough. The majority of society knew this during Reconstruction when they elected to deny black ex-slaves 40 acres and a mule and give them a marginal education and give them a marginal education instead. Education is an empowerment tool only when it is used in the right sequence. Black people were given no choice but to focus on social and educational rights rather than economic rights. In a capitalistic democracy, however, in a capitalistic democracy, however, economic achievement and mobility must occur before a group attempts. Okay, they need to call it here. All right. In a capitalistic democracy, however, economic achievement and mobility must occur before attempts to open up channels of educational opportunities. The educational achievements will then engender a corresponding set of cultural values and a further appreciation for educational achievement. Education allows a group to consolidate and extend its economic gains in the marketplaces. When Jewish immigrants began immigrating to this country in the latter part of the 19th century, they first established an economic base. When Jewish immigrants began immigrating to this country in the latter part of the 19th century, they first established an economic base. Fortunately, they entered the country with some skills that were needed in America's emerging industries. They were able to capture these industries based on cultural experiences and chance than on educational achievements. They were able to capture these industries based more on cultural experiences and chance than on educational achievements. After succeeding in these industries, they used their acquired wealth, political clout, and social acceptance to enter and begin dominating education. If blacks are going to eliminate the myths about why they have not achieved, they must understand that structural racism forced black Americans to lift themselves in reverse by putting education and social goals before economics. Though blacks demonstrated particular educational achievement, okay, though blacks demonstrated spectacular educational achievements and a total willingness to be long suffering, they could not translate those educational achievements into economic gains. There is practically no inherent economic power associated with educational achievement. Black America has encouraged its children to get a good education and find a good job in a white corporation or some level of government. Most ethnics, especially Jews and Asians, encourage their children to get a good education, develop develop some develop some on the job experience, then use their education to start their own business. There are few black businesses in which black children can use their educational skills. As stated earlier, clearly a fundamental change is needed in the role that schools play in the lives of black people. Who are schools failing? Who are schools failing? Okay, one of the most frequently heard complaints in our closing years of the 20th century was this was that schools are failing. If public schools are failing, they are failing only whites, Asians, Hispanics, and other ethnic immigrants. Schools do not now, nor did they ever fail in what they were designed to do for black children: create a labor class in service to white society. Schools have always been mirrors that reflect the values, goals, needs, and priorities of the society and the communities they serve. They have remained exclusively controlled by whites through government policy makers, boards of education, and major corporations. These powerful bodies approved curricula, staffing, and educational or instructional materials. Regardless of their physical location, racial, ethnic makeup, schools, regardless of their physical location, racial, ethnic makeup, schools across America had to teach their children European American values. Ooh, that hurt. Ooh, okay. The quality of teaching and the educational outcomes track the racial lines of power and wealth. The academic scores of elementary and secondary schools strongly correlate with parental income, wealth, and education. High income students can more easily afford special coaching from parents, professional remedial help, and private schools. Schools perpetuate wealth and racial advantages that are intergenerational in nature. Schools produce in their students whatever skills, attitudes, and or other characteristics public policy makers and business owners need in their present and future workforce. Following the Civil War, for example, the country needed a industrial labor force. President Lincoln signed a national immigration law in the early 1860s that encouraged migration from Europe, Asia, and Spanish speaking countries. So, America's first public schools following the Civil War were established to educate the influx of immigrants to become leaders of industry, business owners, professionals, and members of the managerial classes. Ignored by Lincoln, blacks were never educated to be owners, managers, or members of the intellectual class. They were educated to be the workforce for those over classes. The Powernomics education plan. The Powernomics education plan. Powernomics education plan calls for a total reconstruction of schools in black neighborhoods, like an assembly line that is producing an outdated and non-competitive product. The educational assembly lines within black communities need to be shut down and engineered to address the collective needs of the children and their communities. Black children come to schools bearing different burdens, experiences, and needs. They are entitled to an education program that addresses who and what they are. The same is true with the black community. They too have goals and ambitions for their children, both the needs of the students and of the goals of the adults ought to be reflected in the National Education Plan. This plan, this plan should dovetail with what Black America wants to achieve and where it wants to go. Since the primary purpose of education is to be the great equalizer, restructuring the educational experiences of black children to promote their competitiveness is all in all areas of society is the goal of the Powernomics plan for self-improvement. Once the goals of the education plan have been accepted by black communities, black educators have the responsibility of modifying school curriculum, instructional materials, teaching methods, extracurricular activities, administration, community based activities, school parent relationships, and even professional services with the specific intent of bringing educational parity to black children. The driver of the reform steps that are offered below is a firm belief that black dominated schools and educators can rise to the challenge and play an essential role in the economic and political reform of black America by the year 2005.